Kael felt the familiar, cold reassurance of the crossbow in his grip. He knew that the coming fight would not be a skirmish. It would be a test of will and endurance, a war he had already started with a weakness labeled right upon his knee. He strapped the specialized weapon to his forearm, the silent mechanism clicking into place. Leaving the armory, Kael began his final, ritualistic patrol. The reliquary was never truly silent, but tonight, the usual grinding of the shifting bedrock and the whisper of residual malice were overshadowed by a profound, expectant hush. It felt like the entire world had held its breath, waiting for him to fail. The cold was no longer just the ambient temperature of the stone. It was an intrusive, focused pressure that seemed to bypass the burnt hide patches and penetrate the core of his being. He limped down the main ceremonial corridor, his senses tuned to the esoteric vibrations that the keepers, wrapped in their pure meditations, could not perceive. The old mark on his knee began to ache, not the dull throbbing of old scar tissue, but a sharp, burning reminder of the entity that had broken him years ago, and the promise of the stalker that now sought to finish the job. The Muoi fan catch, the dividing salt, glowed faintly under the scant lantern light, shimmering with nervous energy. The light seemed to pulse in time with Kael's accelerating heart rate. He checked the black wire weave covering a massive arched window. The wires were humming, vibrating against an invisible force that tried to warp the geometry of the physical space. The stalker was pressing on all fronts, a patient predator testing the tensile strength of the structure. Then, the assault shifted entirely. It didn't come through the stone or the air. It came through the arcane signature that bound Kael to this space and marked him for destruction. You never belonged here, Kael. The thought was not his, yet it resonated with absolute truth in the silent, empty chamber of his skull. It was soft, insidious, delivered with the velvety assurance of something that knew him better than he knew himself. Kael staggered, his hand instinctively gripping the cold stone wall. The stalker wasn't using raw power, it was using regret. He saw the phantom vision of the moment the bone in his leg shattered, the sickening wet crunch, the blinding panic, the subsequent judgment and isolation. He relived the scornful glances of the keepers, their silent relief that he was still useful despite his broken purity. They use your flaws as a shield, Kael. You are nothing more than a carefully placed wound, designed to draw the fire. The pain in his knee intensified, becoming a localized vortex of freezing energy. The stalker was using the physical site of his failure as a focus point, trying to drive Kael into despair and self-pity, the only two emotions that could truly nullify the wards protecting his mind. If Kael surrendered his will, the protective energies layered into the very stone of the reliquary would instantly dissolve. Kael fought back with the only weapon he had, exhaustion. He had maintained this crumbling fortress for years, not through zealotry, but through sheer, numb persistence. He forced himself to focus on the grit beneath his fingernails, the texture of the mortar he had applied just yesterday, grounding himself in the mundane reality of his physical work. I am the mortar, Kael whispered, his voice hoarse. I am the repair. The psychic voice snarled, louder this time, losing its smooth cadence. The stalker recognized resistance. The ambient cold dropped sharply, manifesting as a thin, brittle layer of frost immediately surrounding Kael's left leg. He looked down and saw, for the first time, a visual manifestation of the stalker's probing, a swirling, smoke-like darkness condensing near the floor, licking at the dividing salt. The entity was not fully material, but it was coalescing enough to exert physical influence near the nexus of Kael's pain. It knew the weakness, and now it was capitalizing on it. Kael drew his breath, steadying his aim despite the debilitating chill racing up his spine. This was the moment for the first purity dart. He raised the crossbow, not aiming at the ephemeral smoke, but at the center of the cold sensation, where the stalker's consciousness seemed to be binding itself to the air itself. The silence was absolute as he squeezed the trigger. The tiny, platinum dart flew without sound, a sliver of concentrated holy engineering. It struck the swirling blackness with an impact that was more auditory than physical, a sharp, high-pitched shriek that echoed not in the air, but inside Kael's bones. The smoke instantly recoiled, scattering into nothingness, leaving behind a patch of stone that was now scorching hot, steaming against the surrounding frost. The dividing salt hissed and smoked, its protective barrier momentarily compromised but not destroyed. Kael stood rigid, breathing heavily. He lowered the crossbow. The silence rushed back in, but it was an angry, defeated silence. The purity dart had found its mark, forcing the stalker back from the immediate physical plane. But the entity had tasted his presence, and Kael felt the residue of its fury clinging to him. The cost of the shot was immediate. The old mark was throbbing worse than ever, draining his stamina. He checked the crossbow. 2 darts remained, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that the next time the stalker appeared, it would not be a mere probing attack, but a calculated, brutal breach designed to shatter the Keeper before the Keepers even realized they were under siege. Kael was the sole remaining practitioner of the Gatekeeper's duty at the Reliquary of Ash, a ritualistic fortress perched precariously on the side of a steep, gray-stone canyon. Once a symbol of eternal constancy, the reliquary was now a heartbreaking physical decay. Its stone walls crumbled, its plaster peeled, and this deterioration was more than architectural. It was the fading of the spiritual conviction it was built to safeguard. Kael performed both roles, one moment a gaunt mason patching cracks, the next a silent guardian maintaining the wards against entities seeking the world's dissolution. The relationship between Kael and the Keepers of the Net, those who resided in the inner sanctums, focused on preserving ancient knowledge, was one of conflicted alienation. They needed him, they needed his extreme courage in contacting the rod of evil, yet they shunned him. His constant exposure to the residue of invasive entities left him ritually impure in their eyes. Kael carried an indelible scar, an old knee wound that left him permanently limping, which was not merely a physical legacy, but a potent, magic mark. This mark made Kael clearer, a spiritual beacon drawing the attention of external entities seeking entry into the net. His work was a cycle of repetitive physical rites. He carefully laid lines of separating salt around all entrances, ensured the black wire mesh was tightly woven into the window frames, and, most crucially, replaced the alchemically treated burned skin patches on the ventilation slits. These patches were charmed to obscure their biological warmth, cooling and silencing the pulse of life from the relentless hunt of those who stalked the outer void. Anxiety hung heavy in the thick canyon air. Elder Silas, the Keeper's quiet leader, summoned Kael deep into the shrine. Silas did not request mortar repair, but rather conveyed his deepest fear, the veil thinning. The celestial event that made the fabric of reality brittle was imminent. This time, Silas whispered, the stalker was close. It sought not just physical weakness in the walls, but Kael's psychological fault lines, the despair, the exhaustion, and the fear he bore. Before returning to his rounds, Kael checked his specialized wrist crossbow. He had only 3 of the purity darts remaining. They were the most precious and nearly irreplaceable resource. Forged in ash and then bathed in holy water for 30 days, they were the only things capable of inflicting true, permanent damage on a high-level entity like the Stalker. 3 times, he told himself, was enough. Kael began his final patrol of the night. He dragged his foot down the damp corridors, his lantern light illuminating the ancient ward's sigils carved into the stone. He could feel what Silas had warned him about. His own despair was weakening the boundaries. The absolute conviction of the Protector was the strongest layer of defense, and Kael's conviction was unraveling. He was simply too tired. Suddenly, Kael froze. He did not hear the roar or the smashing he was trained to anticipate. Instead, he heard a low, almost imperceptible friction sound emanating from the deepest parts of the stone walls, a cold, high, nearly soundless hiss, like a razor slicing through silk. It signaled that the Stalker was not attempting to break through the mortar or stone. It was warping space, exploiting the veil's thinness to gain access. In the courtyard, Corvus, his massive black cat, sat beside the mouth of an old, dry well. Corvus's origins were unknown, but he was Kael's only constant companion. He stared into the darkness of the well with unnerving composure. Kael dismissed it. The well had been dry for centuries, sealed with mortar and covered in the most basic protective charms. It was not a threat. This complacency was the greatest weakness. Kael tried to reassure himself with logic, attempting to fit the supernatural chaos into the physical laws he had learned. But he knew the Stalker was a creature that sought the collapse of reason. It preferred to hunt the gaps created by doubt and fear. He gripped the wrist crossbow, feeling the weighty presence of the 3 remaining purity darts. 3 lives. 3 chances. That was all he had between the reliquary and oblivion. As the low-friction hiss grew louder, closer, Kael recalled Elder Silas's cryptic advice. If your defenses fail, Kael, anchor yourself in the ash. He understood it as an invitation to accept failure, to accept potential death, and fight from point zero. But Kael was not yet ready to let go. He still clung to the notion that he must repair and protect, not embrace dissolution. He dragged his injured foot toward the center of the fortress. The hiss stopped abruptly. The resulting deathly silence was far more terrifying. The Stalker was inside. Kael was reinforcing the separating salt lines near the living quarters when he realized the low-friction hiss was gone entirely. He turned and saw Corvus standing on the threshold, staring directly toward the crypt, the resting place of the reliquary's most sacred artifacts, texts, and relics accumulated over centuries. Kael's heart sank. He raced to the dry well. The ancient mortar and ceiling charms had not been broken. They had been melted and warped, like molten metal. The Stalker had used its non-material intelligence to recognize that the well was a psychological weak point because it was deemed too safe, too ancient, to require high-intensity magical defense. Kael understood. The Stalker had entered by exploiting his own overconfidence. Kael scrambled down into the damp, dark crypt. The air was heavy, smelling of cold sulfur. He saw the creature was already there. The Stalker had no fixed form. It was a black, material chaos and noxious green light, constantly convulsing and creating impossible, jagged angles. It was hovering over an antique copper chest, savoring the spiritual energy emitted by the relics within. Kael aimed the wrist crossbow. He felt an extreme cold penetrate his skin. The moment he prepared to fire the first purity dart, the Stalker instantly shifted. It morphed into the image of a younger Kael, kneeling, groaning in agony, having failed disastrously to seal the entity that had injured his knee years ago. You failed, the image of young Kael spoke, the voice echoing with Kael's own desperate cadence. You protected nothing. You are only mortar and dust. Kael trembled. The horror and the guilt over the old failure froze him. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a fraction too long. The fear and horror caused Kael to agonizingly miss his mark. The first purity dart, a piece of silver worth a king's ransom, embedded itself deep into the cold stone wall to the Stalker's left, utterly useless. The Stalker emitted a sound close to laughter, not from a mouth, but from the very stone where the dart struck, causing the entire crypt to vibrate with mockery. 2 darts remained. The Stalker gave Kael no time to recover. It assaulted him with a vortex of high-intensity psychic illusions. Kael felt himself drowning, the screams of his brethren being torn apart, images of the reliquary disintegrating into ash, and the magnified physical pain of his old wound. His knee felt crushed again, the agony so overwhelming he could not stand. Overwhelmed by fury and futility, Kael fired the second dart. He aimed at an illusion of a colossal arm of shadow reaching for him. The dart merely passed through a temporary layer of matter the Stalker had conjured, making a slight whistling sound before vanishing into the void. Useless. Kael slumped to the cold stone floor. He was utterly paralyzed, not by physical force, but by the creature's psychic pressure. He had failed. The reliquary would fall. Just as Kael was about to succumb, an unexpected intervention occurred. Corvus, who had silently followed him, suddenly sprang from the shadow. He did not strike the main, convulsing form of the Stalker. Instead, Corvus bit fiercely into an unprotected region of loose energy, a nexus of mental matter Kael could not perceive with his eyes, but the cat could. The act caused no physical damage, but it created a sufficient distraction to shatter the psychic illusion controlling Kael. The mental pain receded, leaving Kael with raw emptiness and physical throbbing. He painfully gained full consciousness and remembered Silas's advice. Anchor yourself in the ash. Kael understood. He could not win if he tried to be the perfect protector. He had to accept that he had failed. He had lost 2 darts, and he was nearly dead. He embraced the failure, accepted the pain, accepted the potential death. He took a deep breath. He no longer aimed at the images the Stalker generated. He aimed for the fragile, temporary material core the Stalker needed to maintain to exist in this dimension, a tiny, almost imperceptible black point that pulsed at the center of the chaos. Kael fired the third purity dart with absolute calm. The dart plunged straight through the Stalker's forming core. The creature convulsed violently, no longer laughing or projecting illusions. Its shape was ripped apart, as if sucked into a vacuum. The low friction hiss returned, but this time it was the sound of desperate withdrawal. The Stalker was pulled backward through the shaking well, the sealed stone magically reforming behind it. The veil thinning snapped shut instantly. Kael lay in the crypt, utterly spent and covered in stone dust and ash. The smell of sulfur faded, replaced by the familiar damp rock odor. Corvus returned, rubbing against his cheek, his purr the only reassurance of this world's survival. Soon after, Elder Silas and two other keepers appeared with lanterns. There were no cheers, only silent reverence for the devastation. Silas quickly tended to Kael's physical wounds, applying bandages and giving him a special tonic, a concentrated mix of herbs and faith. Silas looked at the wall where the first purity dart was embedded, then at the space where the second had vanished. He quietly accepted the loss of their precious arsenal. He placed a hand on Kael's shoulder and affirmed, "The darts serve the will of the divine. They were used to their purpose, Kael. You bought time." Silas promised they would immediately mobilize all the reliquary's resources to begin the reforging process, though he knew it would take years and require nearly impossible resources. The next morning, Kael did not mend mortar or stone. He performed the rite of spiritual repair. Kael sat among the debris in the crypt, channeling his depleted will and conviction back into the fractured barriers. He recognized that the material barriers were useless if he could not maintain the faith within himself. He had won not through strength, but through the acceptance of weakness. Kael looked at his tired face reflected in the remaining grime on the crypt floor. He acknowledged the grim truth. He had won this battle, but he could not win the eternal war. He was a single soldier in an unending fight. He committed to continuing his work, repairing and defending, until his last breath. But he knew he had to find an apprentice, a successor, before both Kael and the reliquary succumbed to the gatekeeper's exhaustion. The burden was too heavy to carry alone. His work had begun. Kael was in the west corridor, where rock met salt, meticulously reapplying the salt of separation where weeks of desert wind had eroded the protective layer. His concentration was total, his ears straining for the familiar, cold, low-friction screech, the sound of matter being warped, like cold metal dragged over dry bone. That screech was proof of the Stalker's relentless approach, a sign that the physical warding was under invisible pressure. But then, it vanished. Not the abrupt silence of noise being masked, but a complete vacuum, an absence Kael recognized as infinitely worse than any roar. The chill instantly became not the cold of the night, but the cold of vacuum, an absolute quiet that swallowed even the sound of grout crumbling to the floor. This silence signaled that Kael had lost on some fundamental level. His focus had been fragmented by the anticipation, and the Stalker had found the weakness. He straightened, his wrist crossbow unlatched instantly, gripped tight. He spun, his gaze sweeping the corridor for any sign of breach on the black steel wires or the ripped patched hides. Nothing. All remained intact. He felt his body tense as the ache from the old injury in his knee began to flare, as if his own flesh was warning him that the magical signature had been touched. And then Kael saw Corvus. The massive black cat was no longer by the dry wellhead, but standing at the threshold leading down the crypt stone steps. Its golden eyes no longer stared out into the darkness, but inward. It issued a low sound, not of fear, but of resolute warning. "Impossible," Kael whispered, his voice hoarse with terrible disbelief. The crypt, the deepest, most ancient place, containing artifacts even the keepers of the network rarely entered. It was protected by oblivion and charms dating back to deep antiquity, considered impregnable. Kael sprinted toward the wellhead, limping, fighting to ignore the pain strangling his knee. He lunged toward the mouth of the dry shaft, sealed for centuries. The wellhead looked as if a colossal, cold flame had licked it clean. The ancient grout, reinforced with bone and protective herbs, had not been chipped or shattered. Instead, It had been warped. The mortar had softened and flexed like molten rubber, stretched and bowed away from the stubborn stones. The surface charms hadn't been nullified. They were literally bent, no longer facing outward to protect, but inward, into useless spirals. The Stalker had not used brute force. It had used intelligence, recognizing the psychological weakness of Kael and generations of preceding guardians. Complacency. A place considered too safe, too ancient, to require constant reinforcement. The sense of failure was not sorrow, but hideous disgust. Kael had wasted his energy patching minor cracks on the surface, while the enemy had bypassed the entire structure, utilizing a psychically warped tunnel through a logical weak point. "It's here," Kael gritted out. He hesitated no longer. He had to descend to the crypt immediately, before the Stalker could absorb the psychical energy from the artifacts, energy that would make it invincible in the material world. Kael leaped into the distorted wellhead. He slid down the cold stones, using his good leg to control his fall, finally landing hard on the damp, earthen floor of the crypt. The subterranean chamber was dark and oppressive. The air was thick with the smell of mold, but now overlaying it was a sharp, electrical scent, like sulfur and ozone combined. Kael found it instantly. The Stalker stood in the center of the crypt, where the chest of afflictions was housed. The entity was unlike anything Kael had seen in ancient images or the trembling accounts of survivors. It was neither demon nor ghost, but a physical and cognitive inverse. It was continuous chaos, a mass of the deepest black matter visible to the eye, yet fringed with loose, flickering, electric green streaks, like energy leaking out of the entity. Its form continuously twitched and shifted, sometimes resembling a slick oil spill, other times stretching into elongated pseudopods, almost mocking an organic shape. It made no sound, but Kael felt that cold screech echoing in his skull. The Stalker was savoring. It was not attacking the chest. It simply rested a portion of its black matter upon the lid, and Kael could see streaks of green light draining from the precious artifact of the Hoakak and dissolving into the Stalker's body. It was soul siphonage. Kael knew he had no time. He raised the wrist crossbow, aiming directly at the center of the chaotic black mass. He had only 3 purified platinum darts left. 3 chances. If he squandered them, the Hoakak would fall. He took a deep breath, tightening the bowstring, finger hovering over the trigger. He focused his entire will, trying to see through the visual chaos to find the single energy core that the dart could strike and neutralize. The moment Kael was about to fire, the Stalker moved. It didn't dodge. It didn't fly away. It reshaped. The black matter and loose green light contracted and then burst forth into a perfect, terrifying image. Kael himself, but 15 years younger. The young Kael was kneeling on the ground, eyes wide with terror, the rudimentary crossbow fallen beside him. Adjacent to that image, the Stalker projected a partial image of the entity that had attacked him years ago, a shadow with sharp talons, crushing the bone of young Kael's knee. "You think you can fight me?" The voice echoed in Kael's mind, not as sound, but as pure concept. The voice of failure, of self-loathing. "You failed as a child, and that failure created the door for me. Your wound is my invitation, Kael." The physical pain from Kael's knee erupted violently, so sharp he nearly collapsed. The agony was not just sensation, it was a psychic assault, forcing him back into that moment of terror. He smelled old blood, heard his teenage whimper. The horror consumed Kael. He couldn't fire at the enemy. He was aiming at himself, at the memory of his impotence, the weakness that had defined his entire life. The guilt surged so powerfully it paralyzed the gatekeeper's will. He trembled, his finger twitching. "You are merely an exhausted watchman trying to hold on to things that have long since rotted." The illusion mocked. "You have wasted your entire life." In that chaos, fear and terror superseded training. Kael fired, not with intent, but with an unconscious spasm of dread. The first purified platinum dart, the Hoakak's most priceless resource, flew. It sliced past the illusion of the young Kael, doing no harm. It slammed deep into the cold stone wall behind the Stalker, emitting a brilliant, clean white flash, utterly useless. The light quickly faded, leaving only a small, black puncture mark in the stone. Kael had failed. The Stalker abandoned the image of young Kael, reforming into the chaotic black mass. It stood silent for a second, as if considering the gatekeeper's action. And then, from the wall where the dart was embedded, a sound emerged. It was not a roar or a shriek. It was a cold, low-friction sound, almost the hiss of compressed air, a sound identical to laughter, emanating directly from the solid rock. It was mocking Kael, not just for wasting the weapon, but for letting despair and fear govern his action. The Hoakok had lost 1/3 of its final defense, and the Stalker hadn't even broken a sweat. Kael stumbled backward, his bad knee barely holding his weight. He felt the crushing weight of the 2 remaining platinum darts and realized that his desperation had just placed the entire fortress in mortal danger. Kael was nearly broken by the first miss. The guilt surged, not for losing a precious platinum dart, but for allowing personal fear to overshadow his duty. Stalker had targeted him, and the entity had won the opening round. Now, Stalker dispensed with personalization. It emitted a loud, unformed, sickly green energy, filling the crypt with images and sounds that weren't memories, but a synthesis of pure terror. It assaulted Kael with a high-intensity vortex of psychic illusions. Kael found himself standing amid an intolerable spectacle. The hearth, Hoakok, was unraveling. The stone mortar cracked, the wards melted into pools of gray salt, and he heard the distorted screams of the network keepers, the cries of the brethren he swore to protect. These sounds didn't enter his ears. They erupted from inside his skull, rattling his bones and shattering every notion of safety. You failed. You always fail, Kael. A voice, not Stalker's, but his own most desperate internal voice, roared. Stalker amplified Kael's old physical pain. The injury in his knee, the magical signature that caused his limp, began to flare violently. It wasn't a dull ache. It was the sensation of bone being crushed anew, ligaments tearing under the weight of an invisible boulder Stalker had placed on his shoulders. Kael collapsed onto the damp stone floor, his breath ragged and shallow. He gritted his teeth. Rage flared, a purely desperate fire. If he couldn't win through control, he would try to win through destruction. He squeezed the trigger of the wrist crossbow. The second platinum dart launched. Thunk! It failed. The second dart merely pierced a temporary layer of matter Stalker had conjured immediately in front of it, a shimmering veil of green light and stone dust. The creature had perfectly anticipated Kael's reaction. It had foreseen this blind fury and engineered a trap to waste the second arrow. Kael felt tactical and psychological defeat swallow him whole. He now had only 1 dart left. It's over, his internal voice whispered. You have failed everything. Stalker, now confident that Kael was neutralized, began to solidify its form. It was no longer the distorted image of young Kael. It transitioned into a cold, dense mass of black matter, beginning the process of absorbing the magical energy from the artifacts in the crypt, permanently destroying the hearth's mental barriers. Kael's knee was numb. The psychological pain was so intense he couldn't rise. He lay supine, gazing up at the crypt ceiling, where the horrifying images danced, seeing the faces of Elder Silas and the brethren dissolve into ash. Stalker had won. In the moment Kael almost accepted his collapse, an unexpected movement occurred in the dark corner. Corvus, the massive black cat, had followed Kael down into the crypt. He was utterly unfazed by the storm of illusions. He stared directly at Stalker, his golden eyes reflecting the sickly green light with cold indifference. Normally, these extra-dimensional entities are shrouded in a shell of chaotic energy, which shields them from common physical attacks. However, during the energetic transition, as it solidified its form and absorbed power, Stalker had to momentarily loosen its grip on a small section of that energy envelope. This was a zone of loose, almost invisible energy where the truth of its existence intersected with the physics of this world. Corvus leaped. He didn't attack the main black mass directly. Instead, he sprang onto the wall, using his claws to anchor himself, and then bit viciously into the loose energy field about a meter away from Stalker. This action caused no physical damage, but it was an assault on the magical structure. Stalker's chilling hiss was choked into an angry snarl. The psychic vortex engulfing Kael was abruptly interrupted, like a lantern being extinguished. Kael felt the pain in his knee instantly halve. He was still hurt, but his mind was released from the grip of the illusion. It was a sufficient distraction to allow him to breathe and think. He recalled Elder Silas's cryptic advice. If your defenses fail, Kael, find your anchor in the ashes. Ashes. Ashes did not mean physical death, it meant the 0 point. The place where there was no more pride, no more false hope, and no more guilt. It was the absolute acceptance that he had lost 2 darts, he was nearly dead, and his protection had completely failed. Kael closed his eyes for a second, pushing away the images of the melting well, the first dart stuck in the wall, and the throbbing injury. He embraced the failure, and in that acceptance, an absolute calmness took hold. He no longer feared death, because he had already accepted its potential. When he opened his eyes, the crypt was still a scene of chaos. Stalker was there, snarling furiously at Corvus and attempting to stabilize its structure. But Kael was no longer looking at what Stalker wanted him to see. He looked through the blinding green light, through the dense black matter, and through the chaos of terror. He searched. He searched for the temporal matter core. Every extra-dimensional entity, when attempting to maintain a presence on Earth, must generate a physical anchor point, a fragile structural node where it attempts to merge with the laws of physics. It was like a temporary tear in the curtain of reality, and it was the only point where the purified platinum dart could inflict true damage. Kael found it. Located above the chest of artifacts Stalker was trying to drain, there was a tiny point, vibrating at a higher frequency than everything else, a small, twitching rip in the air, too small to be seen by the naked eye, without the absolute focus of a guardian who had accepted the ashes. He slowly raised the wrist crossbow. He didn't have time to use one hand. He gripped the bow tightly with both. The third, and final, platinum dart shimmered in the gloom. It represented the last hope, but to Kael, it represented the end of all calculation. He didn't breathe. He didn't aim at Stalker, but at the void directly above Stalker, the anchor point. Kael pulled the trigger. Whoosh. The arrow flew with terrifying speed and precision. It sliced through the torn air and buried itself deep into Stalker's forming core. The impact was not a loud physical collision, but a deep sound, almost silence. The entity convulsed violently, not from pain, but from structural dissolution. Its black mass and loose green light began to stretch, as if a gigantic invisible hand was tearing it apart. It tried to roar, but the sound immediately twisted into a desperate shriek as it was forcibly ejected from this dimension. The veil thinning at the crypt didn't just close, it violently retracted. Stalker's entire form was sucked backward through the trembling dry well, leaving behind a cold scent of ozone and a fine white dust of ash. Silence settled over the crypt. Kael lay there, exhausted, his hand still gripping the empty wrist crossbow. He had won this battle, but the price had been everything he had. Kael was the gatekeeper of the Reliquary of Ash, a solemn title that encompassed the solitary work of a mason and a protective sorcerer. The ceremonial fortress nestled in a cold, gray rock gorge, its materials degrading daily. Sandstone bricks eroded by wind and rain mirroring the inevitable decay of the spiritual wards the reliquary strove to maintain. Kael was the only one performing both duties. With one hand, he mixed mortar to mend the physical cracks, and with the other, he used his depleted spiritual energy to reform the magical seals. Kael's relationship with the keepers of the net, the hidden scholars and priests within the fortress, was one of necessary estrangement. They required his protection but avoided direct contact, not out of contempt, but because Kael constantly dealt with the residue of evil, leaving him tainted by a cold, defiled energy. Moreover, an old wound on his left knee did more than make him limp. It was a magic mark. That scar, a relic from a sealing failure years ago, had created a gap in his energy field, leaving Kael more susceptible to being sensed and targeted by entities outside the net than anyone else. Kael's work was to maintain the physical and spiritual separation. He circled the entrances, carefully scattering lines of consecrated salt of severance. He wove spell-infused black wire into the cracked window frames, and he replaced the flimsy pieces of burnt hide used to conceal their biological warmth from the things that hunted in the dark. All were temporary protections, standing against those who only waited for the veil thinning to dissolve. In the early evening, Kael was finalizing a sealing charm when Elder Silas summoned him. Silas didn't request a mortar repair, but conveyed deep anxiety. "The veil thinning is upon us, Kael." Silas's voice was low and gravelly. "And this time, the stalker is close. It seeks not cracks in the stone, but cracks in your mind. Your mark is an invitation to it." Kael nodded, a cold anxiety tightening his chest. He returned to his quarters, checking his specialized wrist crossbow, an intricate device fashioned from black steel and fossilized bone. He had only 3 purity darts remaining, forged from rare alloys, steeped in decades of ritual. They were his most precious and nearly irreplaceable resource, the only things capable of inflicting true harm on a higher, extra-dimensional entity like the Stalker. He strapped the crossbow onto his wrist, feeling the cold weight of the reliquary's survival. Night fell, and Kael performed his final patrol before the anticipated astronomical event. The faint crescent moon illuminated the gray stone walls. Kael felt his own exhaustion weakening the wards. He knew well that the absolute belief of the Protector was the strongest layer of defense, and he was lacking it. He yearned for rest, yearned to see a horizon free of fighting. This despair, like damp mortar, was slowly dissolving the strength of the charms. The infiltration did not arrive with any roar or burst of a door. Kael was checking the salt of severance at the west gate when he heard a low-friction sound, almost imperceptible, emanating from the hardest stone walls, a cold hiss, as if a gigantic sheet of glass was being scraped. The sound wasn't an attempt to break in. It was the Stalker bending space, distorting the physical structure to gain access. Kael immediately turned back to the courtyard. Corvus, the enormous black cat, more serene than any other living creature in the fortress, sat beside the mouth of an old dry well, completely forgotten in the corner of the yard, staring into the darkness within. Kael frowned, dismissing it. The well had been dry for centuries and sealed with mortar and charms since the reliquary was built. It was an overlooked weak point born of complacency, a door no one remembered anymore. "Go inside, Corvus," Kael whispered, his voice dry as plaster. Kael tried to use his physical knowledge to reassure himself. The sound could be a draft or a sudden temperature change. But he knew the Stalker was a creature seeking the collapse of reason. It didn't play by the rules of physics. It wanted Kael to doubt what he saw and felt. He gripped the crossbow, feeling the weight of the 3 purity darts, 3 chances, all he had between the reliquary and destruction. In the stillness before the storm, Kael recalled Elder Silas's cryptic advice from years ago, when Kael was a proud apprentice. "If your defense fails, Kael, find your anchor in the ash." He understood it was an invitation to accept defeat, to accept that everything had fallen apart, and to fight from point zero. But Kael was not yet ready to accept death, not yet ready to let go of the hope of keeping the reliquary intact. Kael was reinforcing the salt of severance at another door when he realized that the low-friction hissing had stopped. Its replacement was a deadly silence, the air heavy and cold. He turned. Corvus was no longer by the well. It was standing in the corridor leading down to the crypt, which housed the most sacred artifacts, the spiritual energy source of the reliquary. Kael ran, his limping footfalls echoing violently on the stone floor. He reached the dry well. The ancient mortar and ceiling charms were still there, but they hadn't been broken. They had been melted and warped, as if an invisible hand had kneaded them into a twisted passage leading deep down. The Stalker had used its intelligence to recognize that this well was a psychological weakness because it was considered too safe, too ancient to require additional magical protection. Kael frantically descended into the damp, dark crypt, smelling of ancient earth and mold. The faint light from the lantern on his wrist illuminated the scene. The creature was there. The Stalker had no fixed form. It was a chaos of black matter and sickly green liquid light, constantly twitching and shifting, challenging human understanding of shape. It wasn't attacking. It was tasting the energy from the largest reliquary chest. Kael immediately aimed the wrist crossbow. He felt the first purity dart slide into place. Purity was their greatest strength, and Kael had to use it now. The moment Kael prepared to fire, the Stalker instantly transformed. It was no longer a dark chaos. It morphed into the image of a younger, weaker, failing Kael, kneeling before the entity that had injured his knee years ago. That image replayed the screams of his brethren and the acute pain as his leg tendons were shredded, all Kael's fault. Kael hesitated. Horror, Guilt and fear pulled him back. This wasn't fighting a monster. This was fighting the shadow of his own failure. His muscles stiffened, his perfect aim ruined by uncontrollable trembling. The first purity dart launched painfully, missing the precise target by inches. It lodged deep into the cold stone wall. The stalker recoiled from the pure energy, but was not critically harmed. It emitted a sound close to laughter, not from a mouth, but from the wall itself, an echoing sound, mocking Kael's weakness. The stalker gave Kael no chance to recover. It attacked with an intense, psychic whirlwind of illusions. The space in the crypt warped into a nightmare. The screams of dying brethren in dissolving corridors, images of the reliquary crumbling into ash, and the physical pain magnified from his old injury. His left knee throbbing as if it had been crushed again, not an old scar, but a fresh wound. Kael was overwhelmed. He saw himself as the betrayer, the weak point the stalker had used to destroy everything. In a blind rage and despair, Kael pulled the trigger a second time. The second dart flew, carrying useless anger. It pierced a temporary layer of matter the stalker created for defense, but failed to reach the entity's core. It was useless, absorbed and dissipated into nothingness. Kael collapsed to the ground, his left knee completely paralyzed under the creature's psychic pressure. He couldn't breathe, trapped in the vortex of regret and horror. Just as Kael was about to succumb completely, the stalker prepared to deliver the final blow, reaching out with loose, materializing tendrils to touch Kael. Suddenly, Corvus burst from the corner shadow. The cat had no magical defense, but it possessed a sharp instinct. It launched itself, not attacking the main form the stalker was using to manipulate Kael, but biting forcefully into the unprotected, loose energy area Kael could not see with his physical eyes, the connecting threads that anchored the stalker to this dimension. Corvus's action inflicted no physical damage, but created a distraction large enough. The psychic illusion controlling Kael briefly fractured. Kael, agonizingly sobered, remembered Silas's advice: anchor yourself in the ash. He had lost 2 arrows. He had failed to protect the reliquary from infiltration. He accepted failure. There was no more pride or fear left. Kael lay there, his face covered in stone dust and sweat, accepting potential death. He took a deep breath, no longer aiming at the terrifying image the stalker created, but aiming at the core of temporary, fragile matter the stalker had to maintain to exist in this dimension. With the absolute calm of a man who had nothing left to lose, Kael fired the third purity dart. The pure arrow pierced the stalker's forming core. There was no scream, only a sharp, shattering sound. The creature violently convulsed, its shape torn apart. The stalker was sucked back through the trembling well passage. The magical doorway quickly vanished. The veil thinning immediately contracted, closing, leaving a quiet, cold crypt, and Kael lying amidst the chaos. Kael lay there for a long time after the veil thinning contracted, utterly exhausted and covered in stone dust and ash, both literally and figuratively. The smell of ozone and burned energy permeated the air. He felt as though every ward he had ever maintained had drained his strength just to keep this last piece of ground. Corvus jumped onto his chest, rubbing against Kael's cheek, its deep purr the only assurance of survival outside the crypt. A few minutes later, Elder Silas and 3 other brethren appeared with lanterns. They said nothing. There were no cheers or sighs of relief. Only a silent reverence for the devastation and the sacrifice. Silas knelt beside Kael. He didn't ask what happened, for the traces of the battle in Kael's mind were too clear. "Rise, gatekeeper," Silas said softly. He helped Kael sit up, carefully touching his injured knee. Silas gave Kael a special tonic, liquid and warm, tasting of baked earth and strong herbs. It immediately dispelled the lingering psychic paralysis. Kael gasped, pointing to the wall where the first purity dart was lodged. "We lost all 3, he said, his voice hoarse with the admission of failure. 2 were wasted due to my weakness." Silas looked at the wall, then at the empty space where the second dart had dissipated. He silently accepted the loss of the nearly irreplaceable strategic resource. The darts served the will of the divine. They were used for their purpose, Silas stated, his voice devoid of blame. Only a cold acceptance of the cost of survival. "We have delayed destruction," Silas promised to immediately mobilize all the Reliquary's resources to begin the process of forging new weapons, a process that required the combination of rare matter and rituals spanning decades. He knew Kael might not live to see the fourth dart completed. The next morning, Kael did not immediately repair the mortar or stone. His work today was a different, harder task, the spiritual repair rite. He stood before the dry well passage, which had been hastily resealed with stone and a new, stronger layer of charms. He transmitted his depleted will and faith into the fractured barriers. He closed his eyes, reliving the moment of horror when the Stalker attacked his deepest fears. He forced himself to confront the truth that mortar and black wire were only outer shells. Physical barriers were useless if he could not maintain faith in his ability to win. Kael realized that his victory last night was not due to technical strength, but due to surrender, the surrender of the fear of failure to anchor himself in the ash. Now, he had to transmit that acceptance of despair into the foundations of the reliquary. He touched the cold stone with his hand, transmitting a silent vow. I am weak, but the will of the reliquary is not. I have made mistakes, but I will not repeat them. This was the most crucial repair, the re-establishment of the spiritual faith weakened by the isolation and exhaustion of the protector himself. When he finished, he felt a cold but stable flow of energy return to his body. The wards were not brighter, but they were firmer. Kael looked at his tired face reflected in the dirt and ash clinging to the window. His eyes were sunken, lined with wrinkles. He had won this battle, but he could not win the eternal war. Time was not on his side. Every battle was an irreversible attrition of his body and spirit. He understood the harsh reality. If the Stalker returned while the Purity Dart reforging process was underway, the reliquary would collapse. Silas was right. He murmured to Corvus, the cat curled at his feet. Not strength, but endurance keeps us. Kael committed to continuing his work, scattering salt, patching mortar, and maintaining faith. But he knew this burden was too great for one person. He had to seek an apprentice, a successor, someone who could accept the magic mark and the solitary burden of the reliquary. He had to find someone to teach how to fight not with technique, but with the acceptance of failure and the purity of will. Before both Kael and the reliquary collapsed from the exhaustion of the Soul Gatekeeper, he took his old shovel and began mixing mortar for the crack in the north wall. Simple physical labor was the only cure for his soul's fatigue now. The search for a successor would begin tomorrow.